Some legal steps have to take place potentially in a courtroom before we even find out if all the evidence we have on this guy is thrown out. And when I say all, I mean all the good stuff. Everything that came from identifying him. So it's kind of an interesting argument that's being made, but there's other stuff too. Like apparently there was some other male blood found inside the house and in a glove outside the house. That was a bit of a shock. These things are things that will matter to a jury. So all of a sudden, we're learning a lot more about what his case could actually be to avoid the firing squad.
Fascinating. And boy, as you point out, the stakes are very high. Have a great show.
Appreciate it, Leland. Good to see you. Thank you. And our show starts right now, folks. Happy Wednesday, hump day, big day in the Brian Coburger case, especially if you're wondering, does he even have one? Does he have a defense? And if so, how good is it? They've been so secretive for the last 2 years. But now we're starting to really learn some of the things that he's got up his sleeve, or at least his very competent attorney does. So apparently there were 2 samples of blood found inside the house and outside the house that did not belong to him, but did belong to unknown males. Is this going to be a problem for the state? We're going to talk about that tonight. Not only that, but what about the search for Brian Coburger? Is his lawyer really going to pull this off? Saying you should never have gone the route you went with the genealogy. And everything you did wasn't fair, therefore everything you found doesn't count. I mean, that would lead right up to his arrest and everything after, right? So what would they have? What would they have on him if they don't have that? Yeah, how about also blood? None of the victim's blood, his lawyer says, was found anywhere near him or his car or his stuff or his apartment. Is that really true? Because if so, imagine a quadruple stabbing with none of those victims' blood tracked back to him. I got some explanations for all of it. I'm going to talk about it all in a moment. But you know that feeling you get right before a verdict in a really high-profile case? Like everybody's hushed, everyone's watching TV. Shh, shh, it's almost happening, it's almost happening. You know that feeling? I'm getting one of those because a jury has a case that is almost identical to Casey Anthony's tonight. And they're sequestered, so I don't expect they want to be sequestered long. This is Megan Boswell. That's her little baby, Evelyn. Evelyn was found at 15 months dead, stuffed in a trash can that was filled with rotting trash. She was stuffed upside down. Megan Boswell had never even reported her missing. Never a good sign. Megan Boswell also then blamed everybody else. Megan Boswell then copped to it once they found the body and said, oh yeah, I knew she was dead, but I might have rolled over on her. None of Megan Boswell's facts sound good, but her lawyer says neither does the theory of the state. And guess who's with me tonight? Her lawyer. I cannot wait to ask him so many questions, including why didn't you put on a case? Also tonight, it might be the original, the OG true crime case, Jack the Ripper. Do not tell me you do not know that name. He was plastered everywhere in the 1880s. I mean, this is how they plastered him everywhere, right? He was in every headline. Who was it? Who did these dastardly things to the women on the cobblestone streets of London? Who murdered them, disemboweled them, sliced them up and left them for dead? Who did these horrible things? Ghastly murder in the East End. The pictures were incredible, renditions of the mystery man. But now we actually may have science. Believe it or not, 135 years later, it might be the oldest cold case known, and it might be the oldest cold case solved. I've got the answers. I'm going to tell you what the trail was, all that coming ahead. You can't go anywhere. But any time now, I need to tell you this. Idaho will become the first state in the country to use bullets as its primary means of execution over needles, over gas, over everything. And that, while the powers that be in Idaho are full steam ahead with the firing squads, the state's best-known murder defendant, Brian Coburger, may be inching away from the firing chamber. I did not feel that way a month ago. But in the latest round of hearings, some of which weren't even public, we heard a mix of Hail Mary legal arguments and bombshell disclosures that might move the needle, or the rifle, so to speak. First, let's talk about the bombshells. Ann Taylor, Coburger's remarkable lead attorney. She says that police found male blood in 2 different places that did not belong to her client. The blood was from 2 unknown males. Again, not Brian Coburger. And the samples were found on a handrail in the now demolished house where those 4 students were slaughtered, and in a glove that was found just outside the house. Of course, there was also a massive find on the 3rd floor, a knife sheath with a tiny speck of DNA, presumably left behind by the murderer. And that little speck matched Brian Coburger. And his lawyer has an argument for that, too. She says the process used to link her client, known as investigative genetic genealogy, violated Coburger's privacy rights. 4th Amendment in the Constitution. She is taking issue with the FBI and how it used public genealogy databases like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, that were used to track down Coburger family members and ultimately track down Coburger himself. I'm joined now by our Brian Enton, who's been covering this story from the very beginning. All this kind of gives me the willies. Whenever you think you got a guy dead to rights, whenever you think it's going to be a slam dunk, that the evidence is just massive and it's a mountain, then you get this. But the other unidentified DNA, we're only now hearing that it was blood. Let's start with the first issue, the hand railing. It said something about going up to the 2nd floor, but that also is questionable because the 1st floor is actually the basement. So do we know what hand railing they're actually talking about?
We don't know exactly which hand railing it is, and it is a very strange design, the house. You can see it right there. There's 3 floors, but you don't really know exactly which floor they would count as the 1st floor. So we don't know which one it is. But what's interesting is, people think they know everything about this case. You read the probable cause affidavit, you read all the documents. But what's interesting about these pretrial hearings is that little bits of detail come out that we didn't know about. And you learn a little bit more about the defense strategy. And that's exactly what happened this time. Part of the hearing was open to the public. Part of it was closed. This was last month. And now the transcripts came out and we got all of this new information about what the defense might be, including the fact, you mentioned it, that there are these blood droplets in the house that we didn't know about. One on the handrail, not sure which handrail, one on a glove outside the residence that belonged to men, but we don't know who the man is. They never tested it.
Well, I mean, if I'm the state, I'm saying right now, this was a party house and it wasn't their house only. Even in the summer, there were other roommates who moved out. There have been arguably hundreds of people traipsing in and out of that house, partying with beer cans, cutting their fingers maybe on a beer can. And so any blood on a railing could be a popped pimple, for God's sake. The glove on the outside of the house, I would also say, if I were the state, and I don't know this, and maybe you do, Brian, is this the glove that some stranger found at the front left-hand corner of that parking lot right there, right next to the road? Is this the stranger handing it over to the police saying, here, I think you missed this? Because if that's the case, chain of custody smoked.
I'm imagining it's a different glove. I remember even early on seeing gloves outside the house down by the road where the public was able to walk. I think that was the area where the stranger found one. It appears to me this might have been a glove closer to the residence, closer to the front door. And what's interesting is when the prosecution went to the judge, when all of this was unfolding and said, look, this is the evidence we have. This is the probable cause. We need to get the warrants. They never talked about, according to the defense, they never even brought up this other blood that was located. And apparently they knew about it at the time. The prosecution has now come out and said that it was not uploaded into the CODIS database because it did not meet the criteria, but didn't elaborate on what that meant. But it became pretty clear that they at least knew about this blood early on.
I'm so curious what that means, did not meet the criteria. I mean, blood and DNA, no matter how minuscule, as we learned from the knife sheath. Now, maybe that criteria was bigger because the knife sheath was to the murder weapon. So I get that. Let me ask you about the comment from Ann Coburger, and I'll read it. She said about the blood. She said there's no blood from these 4 students who were arguably butchered in that house, right? There must have been so much blood. I don't know how fast there must have been so much blood? Because there aren't bloody footprints all over the house, and we know that the killer traipsed through the house and walked out the house. There's only one little bloody footprint outside of Dylan's room, but this is what Ann Taylor said. Police found absolutely no connection between Coburger and anybody from 1122 King. There's no blood in his car. He wasn't connected to that house, to the people in that house. Look, they didn't find him for 6 weeks or find his white Elantra for 6 weeks. And what does a criminology student know? That you've got to get rid of evidence, right? Like, what else do we know about what they got when they raided and searched everything of Brian Coburger's?
Yeah, what you just said was also new. What you read from Ann Taylor, another new nugget that's come out of these hearings. I mean, we never saw any evidence in the documents that they found anything related to the victims on Coburger, but now Ann Taylor is coming out and saying, based on the discovery she has, that nothing in the car and nothing in the apartment matched back to the victims. And remember, when you read over those search warrants, I mean, they took apart that car, Ashleigh. They took apart the steering wheel. They took apart the gear shift. They took apart the seats. They were looking for any signs of blood, any hair connected back to the victims. And now you've got Ann Taylor saying that there was none. But you made a good point. Remember, Coburger was getting his PhD in criminology. If there was someone out there that would know how to clean himself up and know how to clean up the car and know how to clean up his apartment, it would be him. And let's not also forget, in Pennsylvania, when the arrest went down and he was at his parents' house, remember, they were doing the surveillance and they saw him with the gloves on, taking the trash out with gloves, and everything was bagged up in little baggies. So the state could very well make the point, look, this guy knew exactly what he was doing and he knew how to cover things up.
Oh, he was bagging trash up into separate little Ziplocs with gloves on in the middle of the night and throwing it out at the neighbor. When a jury hears that, the reasonable mind will say, no, sorry, not buying that that's an innocent guy with OCD, But then there's also the issue that he was seen cleaning that car. And he had 6 weeks between the murder and arrest in which he could have cleaned the car as many times as he wanted to, cleaned his apartment as many times as he wanted to. I'm fascinated to hear what the tests would, what they resulted in when they found brown stains and what looked like blood stains on his mattress cover, the dog hair or the animal hair in his apartment. Was it Kaylee's dog? I'm curious to hear that stuff. Let me do something here, Brian. Let me bring in Dave Ehrenberg to the conversation. He's the former state attorney of Palm Beach County, Florida. This is what he does for a living, or you did until now. You've gone to the dark side, to the defense side of things, Dave. Can you help Brian and me with something here? We were all just a little kind of flummoxed by the did not meet the criteria. The two other blood samples, the one from the railing in the house, don't know if it's first or second floor, basement or middle floor, or third floor, or the blood in the glove found outside. What does that mean when the prosecutors might say it didn't meet the criteria to feed it into CODIS to try to match it up with other people?
Well, good to be back with you, Ashleigh. Hello, Brian. So here's the deal. CODIS users have to adhere to some strict eligibility guidelines before you can enter a profile. And that's because back when Congress enacted the law back in 1994 called the DNA Act, it recognized that the creation of this database would contain genetic data. So they wanted to ensure that only the genetic information from criminal perpetrators was entered. And so the evidence here must be linked to the perpetrator. So, for example, if you have a murder that takes place at a party house, that's what you correctly describe this house as, investigators could seize empty beer bottles. And if there's a DNA profile on the beer bottles and the investigators want to send it up to CODIS, they cannot. It's ineligible. Because although it could be linked to a perpetrator, it could just as easily be linked to someone who's uninvolved. So they wanted to protect those who are uninvolved. So whether it's beer bottles or whether it's gloves found outside or handrails inside the house, which may or may not be linked to the floor where the murders occurred, it's the same thing. They're not eligible to be entered into CODIS.
It's so bizarre. I just assumed if there was blood on a piece of evidence anywhere in a house where 4 murders happened, you want to find out who those people are and then clear them. But it's shocking that CODIS has that kind of strict requirement. bizarre. And I get it. Having DNA, a speck of it on a knife sheath, that's a whole other ballgame, right? That's the murder
Very
weapon.
different.
How about this other issue? Right. How about this other issue that Brian and I were just talking about? And that is that Ann Taylor says, and I'll repeat it because the wording matters here. She said, police found absolutely no connection between Coburger and anybody from 1122 King. There's no blood in his car. He wasn't connected to that house, to the people in that house. No blood in his car, but she doesn't say there was no blood in his apartment, no blood on his things. She stopped at car. Can we take her at face value that she meant all of that when she said no connection to the people in that house?
Ann Taylor is a savvy lawyer. When she says car, she means car. And I point you to the excellent argument from one counselor, Ashleigh Banfield, who said that that car wasn't found until 6 weeks after the murders. 6 weeks, a long time for someone who is a doctoral student, who's used to researching this kind of stuff, to know how to get rid of evidence, to wash the car, to be able to sanitize all the insides of the car. And I think that's what happened. I think this guy, to me, clearly did it. And he took great pains to try to dispose of all the evidence. And in the end, they have his DNA on the knife sheath. That's the biggest evidence here. They also have him driving the car that was used. They also have him using his cell phone before the murders to scope it out. Although the cell phone was turned off during the murders. How interesting that the only time his cell phone was turned off was right during the murders. He's an unlucky guy, just like his alibi, where he said he was searching for stars, looking at stars at that time of night. No witnesses, of course. He was just out there stargazing in his hardtop Hyundai in the middle of winter. Okay.
Yeah, those are all the things that jurors have to decide, is that reasonable? And sometimes they can get over it when it's just one thing that they have to leap over. But if there's a whole chain of weirdo stuff that they're meant to just gobble up, they start to, get sick over it. And that gut tells them too many coincidences, too many silly stories, too many coincidences that I'm not prepared to let go of. Real quickly, only a couple seconds left, Ehrenberg, but I do have to ask you about the fruit of the poisonous tree business. Do you think we're going to have one of those Franks hearings to determine if the way the FBI went into the public databases to get that genealogy linked to Coburger's dad was not fair, according to the courts, and thus everything after it gets tossed in the garbage, which is kind of like the entire case almost?
Ashleigh, who has the privacy interest here? Whose rights are being harmed? Perhaps his distant relative, whose DNA should not have been accessed. But does Coburger have an interest in his distant relative's DNA? No. He has no argument here, no claim. Dismissed. Not the case, by the way. His argument will be dismissed. Not the case. That's going to trial.
So do you think there's actually going to be a Franks hearing to decide that? Or is the judge just going to say, this doesn't even deserve a Franks hearing, let's just move on?
When in a high-profile case where he's facing the death penalty, they'll give him a Franks hearing. They'll give him every benefit of the doubt. But in the end, he ain't winning it.
I wonder if that'll delay things. I mean, look, we got a lot to fit in before July, August beginning. So, Brian Enton, great reporting as always. Dave Ehrenberg, brilliant. Love you to pieces. Thank you. And if I were in a murder case, there's no way I'd defend myself. I would call you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Ash.
Thanks, Ash.
Right. So there's a really strong possibility that Brian Coburger could be found guilty of those murders. And then there's a even realer possibility he could get the death penalty for it. What we're not used to hearing is that he could be shot to death as his method of execution. Idaho is full steam ahead with its plans for a new firing squad chamber. And just ahead, we have the costs involved, the logistics, and whether it is actually worth the taxpayer money or if it's going to break the bank per inmate. Next.
Become depressed, have sudden behavior or mood changes, or suicidal thoughts. Don't take Ingrezza if allergic. Serious side effects may include allergic reactions like sudden, potentially fatal swelling and hives, sleepiness, the most common side effect, and heart rhythm problems. Know how Ingrezza affects you before operating a car or dangerous machinery. Report fever, stiff muscles, or problems thinking, as these might be life-threatening. Shaking, stiffness, drooling, and trouble with moving or balance may occur.
Take control by asking your doctor about Ingrezza.
They walk the inmate to the chamber and they strap him into a chair that is surrounded by sandbags. They put a hood over his head and they pin a target over his heart. 5 marksmen line up behind a wall with a tiny slat just big enough to poke their rifles through. 1 marksman has a blank, but the others, they all have real bullets. And on the count, they all fire at once to the target. That is how a firing squad works. And thanks to Bill HB 37 in Idaho, Brian Coburger could be walked through that very protocol if he's found guilty of those 4 student murders. While some people celebrate that it is just what killers deserve, others complain it's barbaric. But few people talk about the cost, because it ain't cheap to shoot someone to death. We wanted to know what Idaho is actually spending on its shooting chamber, so we reached out to the Department of Corrections and we got some fascinating details back from them. Here is what they wrote to us. I'm going to read it. We have implemented a phased approach for retrofitting the F block at Idaho Maximum Security Institution, also known as IMSI, to accommodate execution by firing. Phase 1 consisted of F-block imaging design and engineering for total F-block renovation and Phase 1 construction. The total cost of Phase 1 was $313,915. Phase 2 will consist of a full renovation and the remainder of F-block, and the initial estimate for Phase 2 is $952,589. Once we're prepared to proceed with Phase 2, we will rescope the project and refine the estimate. We have no plans to seek additional appropriation for this project. We have not finalized our policies and procedures and do not have specifics to share at this time. However, we are considering the use of a remote-operated weapons system alongside traditional firing squads. That's super interesting. A remote-operated weapons system, like robo-killing. So roughly $1 million to build the chamber. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because on average, it takes a few decades to get all the way through the mandatory appeals, constitutional, and the litigation that ultimately results in a death penalty being carried out. A study by the Oklahoma Death Penalty Review Commission said that in the 27 states that actually use it, on average, it adds about $700,000 to the cost of a criminal case. So you've got to ask the money, especially if you're footing the bill in your state. Is it worth the money? Especially when you consider the number of inmates who will actually die by that method. Dr. James Williams is a leading courtroom expert in the subject of firing squads. He is also an ER physician, and he's here with me live. Dr. Williams, thank you so much for coming back. It's good to see you again. So I guess the first question I have for you, looking at this $1 million remodel, it's like the first person that gets executed is $1 million execution, and then you dollar cost average after that, right? Is it actually worth the money to invest in methods of execution at this point in America?
Well, that's a very good question, Ashleigh. As you know, my work with on the cases that I've been involved in have been primarily involved with federal public defenders' offices across the nation. And it's a multi-person team. I testify primarily to the medical aspects, but I also have a great deal of familiarity with the more practical aspects, shall we say. There's no question that executions are extremely expensive. Capital punishment costs on average in Texas about $2.3 million per inmate. I can't attest to other states that I haven't looked into more recently, but it is extremely expensive. And in some cases, if there's multiple trials, multiple appeals, it may be well above that. So the question is valid. Is it really worth what we're spending to do so? And that's something that has to be decided by the taxpayers and the legislatures in each individual state, I think.
But it's, I'm not so sure that a lot of those taxpayers know this, right? I think they think it's cheaper to get rid of them than keeping them alive in prison and feeding them and clothing them and housing them and guarding them until they die a natural death. Do you know roughly, and I know every state's different, but do you know roughly the comparative on what it costs to put someone away for the rest of his life rather than, go through all the appeals and sometimes 20 years of litigation in order to carry out an execution?
Right. That's a big issue. The amount, the amount that I've seen in the work that I've done shows that it's somewhere between $1.2 and $1.4 million more expensive to execute a prisoner than it is to keep him for life not on death row, but in general population. So that's $1.2 million difference. That is a significant hit to the taxpayer.
And, every state, again, is different, but Texas executes a lot of its death row inmates. And so, let's just say it's 5 in a year. You're looking at, roughly $7 million in taxpayer money that they're spending. And I guess at that point you have to ask the voters, is it worth the retribution? Because we all know at this point that it just doesn't dissuade people from killing. Knowing there's death penalty doesn't change the metrics on who decides to kill or who doesn't.
Well, I don't know that that's absolutely true. I think that some of the research that has been done has been, shall we say, slanted toward finding a lack of deterrence, whereas some of the other research has tended to lean the other way. So I think that question is still open to some degree. But for the most part, I think most of us agree deterrence is not a great reason to use the death penalty.
Yeah, and I only think about states with the death penalty, 27 of them. They don't seem to have a lower record of murders, and so that's why I kind of just look at per capita murders in the death penalty states. I haven't seen that it's been a great benefit, and we've had death penalty for many decades. I've got to ask you in my last question here about the remote operated weapons system. Oh, it just feels so macabre. And I know that it all feels macabre to some people, but robots killing the inmate, is that realistic?
Sure it is. Actually, since we spoke last, I looked into this a little bit. There's various methods that have been tossed around in those circles. Basically, what you're talking about is having multiple fixtures for a rifle, which are very commonly available on the market, that hold the rifle rigidly in place, and then the rifle can be fired electronically by just pressing a button. All the rifles can be fired in unison by just pressing a button. So that would take away the need for individual riflemen, the variability that might exist in the capability of the individual rifleman, although I don't think that's really been an issue at all in Utah, except for one execution over half a century ago.
I can't remember if it was you or someone else who told me that finding the marksman, there's a long line of people who want to be a part of that process. So, and then I don't know that they get paid. And if they do, I can't imagine it's a whole lot. Do you know that? I only have like 5 seconds left, but did they get paid? Did they get paid a lot?
They are paid, but there's also a price that they pay afterwards psychologically. It's not trivial.
Okay, you know what? You just lined up a whole new segment for another day. The effect, I mean it. I never thought about that, but you've got me going now, and the segment's over. But would you come back and let's talk about those who participated in firing squads and the effect afterwards? Maybe not for everybody, but for those who were affected. I'm fascinated. Thank you so much for this, Dr. Williams. Good to see you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Putting it on the calendar that we are going to do that segment, because that's fascinating. Okay, after a break, the biggest day yet in a trial that I have been calling Casey Anthony every day but Wednesday, and today's Wednesday, so I'll say it. Both sides finally rested. The lawyers got one last chance to go after the jury to get them to see their point of view, and guess what? That sequestered jury started deliberating. The very biggest day, of course, is still to come. That's at the jury's choosing, but it's the day that Megan Boswell, that young mom right there, can only hope parallels with the verdict Casey Anthony got.
As to the charge of first-degree murder, verdict as to count 1, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty.
There is one man who is absolutely convinced that his client, Megan, will avoid a murder conviction too, and that defense attorney is live with me when we come back.
You realize you've got 4 mortgages on your house that you didn't even know existed.
Unfortunately, it's on you to protect yourself. You might already be a victim. Check your title status now at HomeTitleLock.com.
Murder trials are not games, they are not sport, and they are not entertainment, but we all know the feeling when a blockbuster verdict is about to drop. The heart-pounding suspense, the breathless anticipation. We usually stop what we're doing, and then we can't look away till we get that verdict. Case in point, Casey Anthony. You know where you were. But brace yourself, because Casey Anthony 2.0 has us all holding our breath tonight. Jury deliberations are underway in Megan Boswell's trial. She's the young mother in East Tennessee who never said a word when her toddler went missing. When Grandpa found out, he was the one who called the police. The teenager insisted her little girl was only missing and that someone else had her. Sound familiar? That 15-month-old toddler had a name. It was Evelyn Boswell. And police found her little body jammed upside down into a garbage can that was filled with rotting trash. That's when Megan Boswell, the teenage mom, copped to knowing that the baby was actually dead and changed her story again, saying that maybe she or her boyfriend had rolled over accidentally on the baby, smothering her. That was her story. Since the jury in this case is sequestered, we may not have to wait very long for a verdict, but I have been wrong about these things in the past. And for all the similarities to Casey Anthony's case today, we saw one very big difference. The defense rested without calling a single witness. For their part, prosecutors say the little girl's murder was premeditated. The defense says the state didn't even prove a murder, let alone that Megan did it. Here's a little bit of the closing arguments.
The defense wants to say that perhaps, again, speculating, it's a possibility that Evelyn just died one day in early December. And then all of a sudden, Megan engages in this pattern of just totally bizarre behavior that involves wrapping her child in a blanket, tightly pressing her head in aluminum foil and stuffing her in a trash can, and then engaging in this just convoluted tale to anybody who wants to inquire about what's going on with Evelyn.
I don't have to prove this case. I wish I could, but I can't. You can't prove a negative. What I can tell you is the state has not proven their case. They've not proven the cause of death. They've not proven that the death was an unlawful killing as opposed to an accident, or some rolling over in the bed being an accident, or some kind of health-related issue. They haven't proved that.
That was Megan Boswell's defense attorney, Gene Scott, who happens to be live with me right now. Mr. Scott, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate this. I've got so many questions for you, starting with this. Casey Anthony's case, we can all agree there were so many parallels, but her attorneys went to great lengths in court to put on this whole alternate theory. It took weeks and weeks to hear out that whole alternate theory, and she was acquitted. You chose to not put any witnesses on, any alternate theories in front of this jury with evidence and with witnesses. Why is that?
It was our decision at the time. We felt like we ended yesterday on a high note. The state put on 2 medical examiners. The first one, she went through a lot of proof with about what could have caused the death. And she ultimately, although she was she wavered a lot, I felt like she contradicted her report. And I felt like she opened the possibility that she said it could have been from SIDS, it could have been from a rollover, and it could have been from an accident. So I felt good about that. The other medical examiner they put on was very evasive, but finally, after being threatened with contempt of court for not answering questions, she finally stated that, in fact, she could not conclude where the child was when she died. Specifically, was the child wrapped in the blanket in tinfoil. She could not conclude that. So I felt like we ended on a high note, so we didn't put on proof. Here's
where I see you got to admit that there's just a lot of bad facts for your client, right? That's what we call them. In this business, we call them bad facts. And the jury is not immune to that. Why not call the boyfriend? His name is Hunter Wood. If there was some accidental rollover, would Hunter Wood not answer those questions the way maybe you'd want the jury to hear?
The boyfriend, Hunter Wood, is unavailable. He is in a mental hospital in Marion, Virginia. Both the state and I have tried to obtain his presence. We were unable to do that.
What about mom and dad, Megan Boswell's family members? Would they have taken the stand to help her navigate, at least help the jury navigate through Megan's versions of the story?
They weren't present. Her dad did take the stand. He was one of the first witnesses the state called. If you'll recall, he was the witness who he reported Evelyn missing sometime, I think, in February of 2018, or 2020, I'm sorry, February 18th of 2020.
But he wouldn't get on the stand to back her and keep her from a murder conviction?
Well, there would be no reason to call him. He wasn't there when the child died. He couldn't say one way or the other what happened to the child.
Well, he might be able to testify to the lying and why. It feels as though and I sat through the entire Casey Anthony case, verdict, everything, jury selection, you name it. It felt like that jury needed to hear something other than what the prosecutors laid out. And Jose Baez and team, they gave that. They handed the jury a whole other way that it could have happened. And as we know, we were all gobsmacked, right, when the jury came back with not guilty. Are you confident that's what's going to happen in your case?
I'm hopeful that's what will happen in my case. I've left this in God's hands. Megan has left this in God's hands. We put on the best defense we could put on given the circumstances and the facts we were dealt. I felt like we were very effective with both medical examiners in being able to at least show to the jury that this is not a certainty of how the child died. And in any murder case, you need a cause of death. They don't have one. Am I certain that'll work? Absolutely not. But it was the best defense we could put on.
And of course, she did not take the stand in this case either. So I hope you will come back, Gene Scott, when we have a verdict and talk about this. I appreciate you coming on tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Also, to our viewers, we did ask the Sullivan County, Tennessee District Attorney for their input in the case. They said no comment until everything is completed. That is not unusual in a case like this. Still ahead tonight, what is the most famous cold case you can think of? Jack the Ripper. Multiple gruesome murders in the 1880s. Women butchered on the dark cobblestone streets of London. Tonight, scientific certainty. We finally know who he is. And you will too after the break.
Buy Complete Balanced Nutrition for strength and energy.
Ensure with 27 vitamins and minerals, nutrients for immune health, and Ensure Complete with 30 grams of protein.
Serial killers' nicknames come up a lot on this show, but for my money, the best one probably is the first one, Jack the Ripper. Got to be honest, the name Aaron Kosminski just doesn't have the same impact, doesn't pack the same punch. But tonight it is confirmed, if not yet official, Kosminski did indeed pack the same punch as Jack because they are one and the same. Let me take you back almost 140 years to the Whitechapel area of London. This is where I need to stop and warn you that the photos I'm going to show are graphic. At least 5 women were slashed to death on those cobblestone streets. Their organs were removed. It happened between August and November of 1888. Aaron Kosminski was a 23-year-old immigrant who'd come to London years earlier from Poland. His occupation? Can't make it up. Barber. Person of interest was not a term back then, but it really would have applied because police looked at Kosminski. They just never had enough evidence to arrest him. They really never had much evidence, period. Fingerprints weren't even an acceptable crime-fighting tool in Britain until almost a decade later. That is how cold this case is. But that uncertainty about Aaron Kosminski did not stop Madame Tussauds from immortalizing him in wax and including him in the Jack the Ripper Chamber of Horrors. But beyond that, and certainly before that, there was nothing definitively tying him to the Ripper until now. And what is that evidence, you ask? I thought you would. It seems the Ripper's 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes, was wearing a shawl the night that she and one other victim were killed just minutes apart, killed and mutilated. The shawl was blood-stained, of course, and somehow in 2007 it was put up for auction. The winning bidder was an author and Jack the Ripper scholar named Russell Edwards, and Edwards went right to work testing the century-old shawl for DNA. And the results? A 100% match to Aaron Kosminski by way of his oldest brother's great-great-granddaughter, who provided a sample for comparison. Edwards now wants a formal inquest to officially put one of history's greatest mysteries to rest. And though it is far too late for Kosminski to pay for his crimes, you might be comforted to know that he did end up locked up for the rest of his life in a mental asylum, being treated for schizophrenia. There's no word on whether any other patients in that sanatorium turned up dead or missing. Still ahead tonight, the difference between wedding bells and alarm bells. The wedding, I'm assuming, is off after the bride-to-be allegedly stabbed her fiancé in the neck. Police say they were arguing over the venue, to which I say, thank God they hadn't paid the caterer. So what was so troubling about the venue? Story's next. Wednesday is Friday. Wedding season just around the corner. And what better time for relationship tips from Banfield? Tip number 1, if your fiancé stabs you in the neck with a kitchen knife, pretty good chance it wasn't meant to be. Case in point, Kaylee Brantner, a young bride-to-be in Brookfield, Wisconsin. After some heated words with her future mother-in-law about maybe holding the wedding at the house, and then some even more heated words with her fiancé about that, Kaylee allegedly went after that fiancé with a kitchen knife. When police arrived, the still bleeding victim told police that he fled to the basement, but that his bridezilla followed, slashing his arm, chest, and neck, and only backing off when he fell to his knees. Kaylee Brantner was charged with first-degree reckless injury using a dangerous weapon. And although she did make bail, she's been ordered to stay at least a mile away from her one and only. Which leads me to say, let's just hope they hadn't already sent out the invitations. Beep. Hey, tonight at midnight, episode 5 of my podcast, Drop Dead Serious, the feature Uncle Peter. That drops. It's streaming on all the podcasts, all the platforms, wherever you get them. Just hit that QR code. Would love to hear what you have to say about it. Again, Uncle Peter, the most notorious sex criminal to roam the planet, happened to be a guy I called Uncle Peter growing up. So I did a podcast about it. Hope you'll check it. Meantime, Cuomo's next.
Hey, who wants less time with Elizabeth Vargas? Chris Cuomo here. Welcome to NewsNation. Trust but verify, said President Reagan. Remember that? Interestingly, you know what? That was a Russian expression, and he was using it against Russia. Where is that caginess gone? And now dealing with this, this duplicitous Putin with this kind of deference. But we're getting the redux of Reagan's bromide. Transparency builds trust. That's what Elon Musk told us from the Oval Office. And it's a good line, and it's an important one. He talked that talk, but he has to walk that walk. And I'll tell you why. People say what they're doing right now is the change that America voted for. And I'm one of them. But here's the truth. I'm not completely right. Here's why. Trump won the election. He got more votes, the popular vote, but barely.